Her voice arrived before she did. Low, velveted, unmistakable. It slipped through radios and cinema speakers, curling into the memory of a nation before anyone learned her face. For years, that voice suggested confidence, temptation, control. It sounded like someone who belonged in the center of attention. Someone unafraid of being heard. But voices can deceive. Some are performances built to protect what cannot be shown. Behind one of the most recognizable voices in Britain was a woman who spent much of her life withdrawing from the very world that celebrated her. While audiences laughed, listened, and leaned closer, she learned how to disappear without vanishing. Fame did not abandon her all at once. It softened, it quieted, and eventually it left her alone with her own thoughts. This is not a story about scandal, nor about a sudden fall from grace. It is about the distance between sound and silence. About a life where being heard by millions did not mean being understood by anyone. And about how Fenella Fielding became a voice remembered long after the woman herself chose to step back into the quiet. What happens when the voice survives, but the person retreats? By the late 1950s and early 1960s, her presence felt unavoidable. Fenella Fielding's voice carried a texture that set her apart from every other woman on the British screen. It was not simply seductive. It was controlled, playful, faintly unsettling. Directors leaned into it. Writers shaped lines around it. Audiences remembered it long after the scenes ended. She emerged at a time when British cinema was learning how to flirt with suggestion rather than spectacle. Comedy, satire, and gothic undertones gave her a space to stand out without needing to shout. Her performances balanced elegance with eccentricity, turning minor roles into moments people quoted and replayed. Radio embraced her just as eagerly as film, allowing her voice to travel further than her image ever could. Critics praised her for a presence that felt intelligent rather than decorative. She became associated with characters who seemed to know more than they revealed. Women who spoke softly while holding the upper hand. This was her golden image, confident, distinctive, and in control. The public heard assurance. The industry saw reliability. And for a time, the spotlight stayed warm. Yet even at her peak, something felt slightly misaligned. The attention was fixed on a sound, a tone, and effect. The woman behind it remained carefully out of focus. As her voice echoed through cinemas and living rooms, a quieter question lingered beneath the applause. What did it cost to be remembered this way? Long before her voice became a public possession, Fenella Fielding learned what it meant to stand apart. She was born into a family that valued restraint, discipline, and clear social boundaries. The stage did not belong in that world. Performance was seen as indulgence exposure, a choice that invited judgment. When she gravitated toward acting, it was not greeted with pride, but with distance. This early resistance shaped her more than any formal training. Choosing the theater meant accepting separation. It meant understanding from the beginning that belonging would come at a cost. While others entered the industry with encouragement or safety nets, she moved forward knowing she might have to do so alone. That sense of emotional self-reliance became a defining trait rather than a temporary phase. Acting for her was not an escape from herself. It was a way to control how she was seen. The voice that would later define her career was carefully cultivated not only as an artistic tool, but as a form of armor. It allowed her to project confidence without revealing vulnerability. It created distance between the inner life she protected and the image audiences consumed. There was motivation in that distance. The desire was not simply to succeed, but to define herself on her own terms. Each role, each performance reinforced the idea that identity could be constructed deliberately. The stage offered clarity that personal life did not. Within scripts and characters, rules were visible. Outcomes made sense. Yet this foundation carried a quiet consequence. Independence hardened early. Emotional privacy became instinctive. By the time recognition arrived, the habit of holding back was already deeply ingrained. Fame would amplify her presence, but it would never dissolve the boundaries she learned to build at the very start. Fame did not arrive as a storm. It unfolded gradually, carried by repetition. The more often her voice appeared, the more it became a shorthand for a certain kind of woman. Witty, suggestive, self-possessed. Audiences began to recognize the sound before the name, and the industry learned how to use that recognition efficiently. She was cast not for transformation, but for consistency. This kind of success brought security, but it also imposed limits. Roles came with expectations already attached. The voice that set her apart slowly confined her. Instead of being seen as an actor who could disappear into different lives, she was asked to return to the same emotional register again and again. What felt like distinction at first became a frame that was difficult to step outside. Public admiration rarely extends beyond what it wants to preserve. Her image was admired, but narrowly. The intelligence behind it, the discipline, the private complexity remained largely unexamined. Interviews reinforced the persona rather than challenging it. The industry preferred the effect she created over the person creating it. Within this environment, isolation grew quietly. Attention did not translate into connection. Professional recognition did not offer emotional grounding. Relationships, both personal and creative, were shaped by the same imbalance. She was visible, but not truly seen. Heard, but not deeply understood. The cost of this kind of fame is subtle. It does not announce itself through collapse or scandal. It appears in repetition, in the narrowing of possibilities, in the quiet realization that the space between public image and private self is no longer closing, but widening. Maintaining the persona required energy. Stepping away from it felt increasingly necessary. The spotlight remained, but it no longer felt expansive. It became directional, fixed, and limiting. And with each performance that reinforced the familiar, the idea of retreat began to form not as failure, but as relief. There was no single moment when everything broke. No headline announcing a downfall. Instead, the fracture revealed itself through absence. Fewer offers arrived. Familiar collaborators moved on. The industry's attention shifted not with cruelty, but with indifference. What had once felt essential slowly became optional. This period was marked by adjustment rather than collapse. She continued to work, but the rhythm had changed. The roles no longer carried the same weight, nor did they offer the control she once relied on. The persona that had protected her now felt exposed by repetition. Sustaining it required more effort than it once did, and the reward felt increasingly distant. Emotionally, this was a quiet reckoning. The realization was not that fame had failed her, but that it had reached its limits. The structure she had built around her career no longer supported the life she wanted to inhabit. Visibility came with expectations she no longer wished to meet. Retreat began to feel less like loss and more like alignment. Rather than fighting to remain present, she chose reduction. Fewer appearances, fewer explanations. A gradual withdrawal that allowed her to reclaim time and privacy. This decision was not dramatic, but it was decisive. It marked a shift from performing for others to preserving something for herself. The rift between public memory and personal reality widened here. Audiences remembered the voice at its peak, frozen in time. Meanwhile, the woman behind it was redefining her relationship with attention. What looked like disappearance from the outside was from within a controlled narrowing of focus, a movement away from noise toward something quieter and more manageable. The final chapter of her public life unfolded without announcement. There were no farewell interviews, no closing performances framed as conclusions. Instead, Fenella Fielding withdrew into a smaller world, one defined by routine privacy and control. For nearly 2 decades, she lived quietly away from the industry that had once shaped her days. The apartment became both refuge and boundary. Visitors were few, expectations were minimal. This period was not marked by isolation imposed from the outside, but by a deliberate narrowing of contact. She had spent a lifetime being interpreted through sound and image. Now she chose stillness. The absence of public presence did not signal despair. It suggested a recalibration, a decision to live without constant translation for others. One detail from these years lingers with particular weight. She reportedly recorded hundreds of private monologues, fragments of thought preserved without an audience. These recordings were not intended for performance. They were not released explained or contextualized. Their existence alone speaks volumes. A woman known almost entirely for her voice continued to speak even when no one was listening. What those recordings contain remains unknown, and speculation would miss the point. What matters is the impulse itself. Expression without consumption. Voice without response. In a life defined by being heard, this final act reclaimed speech as something personal rather than transactional. Her passing was met with respectful acknowledgement, but little excavation. The industry remembered the voice. The public remembered the effect. Yet the quiet years remained largely untouched. Her legacy rests not only in what she gave to audiences, but in the choice she made to step away, preserving a private interior space that fame could never fully enter. Fenella Fielding's life resists the neat arc audiences often expect. There was recognition, admiration, and a voice that lingered in cultural memory. But there was also restraint, distance, and a long stretch of chosen quiet that followed the applause. Her story is not defined by what was taken from her, but by what she chose to keep. The contrast is where her meaning lives. A woman celebrated for being heard learned how to value silence. A performer associated with confidence built a private life shaped by boundaries. Fame offered visibility, but it never promised understanding. In stepping away, she refused to let her identity be reduced to a single sound, however beloved it was. Her journey invites a different way of looking at success. Not as something to be sustained at all costs, but as a phase that does not have to consume an entire life. Some stars fade unwillingly. Others dim the light themselves carefully to protect what remains unseen. Perhaps that is her quiet lesson. That retreat can be an act of dignity. That silence can be a form of authorship. And that every voice we remember once belonged to a person whose inner life we may never fully know. How many figures do we think we understand simply because we have heard them? If stories like this resonate with you, consider sharing your thoughts, joining the conversation, and exploring more journeys where fame and privacy collide.